Welcome to Raw Data. I'm Leslie Chang.
And I'm Mike Osborne.
The mid-peninsula in particular, where Silicon Valley is now, it has sort of what a lot of people perceive to be sort of an ideal moderate climate.
This is Daniel Swain. He's a climate scientist at UCLA, and he also runs the popular California weather blog.
The Bay Area climate is fundamentally a cool marine climate where it's not too hot in summer and not too cold in winter.
Say what you will about Silicon Valley, the weather here is fantastic.
And the reason for that is that there is what's known as oceanic upwelling immediately offshore of San Francisco. If you come in the summer months in particular, it can actually be colder near the water then than in the spring or autumn and sometimes even the winter months. And that's because this layer of low clouds, low stratus, and fog is just so prevalent during the summer months especially. If you're in San Francisco or you're in Palo Alto and watching the fog rush in over the Santa Cruz Mountains on a July afternoon, the top of that cloud there is the top of the layer where those temperatures are increasing with height. And if you go up to the top of Mount Diablo, for example, or Mount Tam in the North Bay, you're typically above the marine layer, so you can actually look down on that fog and low clouds. A lot of people could rightfully argue it's pretty ideal.
So why bring up the weather?
Silicon Valley has a reputation for being a place that promotes utopianism and for optimizing everything. So is it really a coincidence that the weather here is so perfect? I'm just saying, food for thought.
Today's episode is the second in our series on the origins of power in Silicon Valley. The tech industry here promotes a way of thinking about the world, and we're dedicating this whole season to tracing the history of that worldview. And on this episode, we're going to look at how the Valley started accumulating all its power, how it came to be a center of influence.
In our last episode, we told the story of how Stanford University was formed. It turns out that Stanford is not just next door to Silicon Valley. In many ways, it's responsible for creating it. And while Stanford was founded in 1891, it really wasn't until the mid-20th century that the Valley started looking anything like it does today. So what happened?
In the early 20th century, the Santa Clara Valley was not very populated. It was mostly orchards. It was called the Valley of Heart's Delight. There were a few technology companies making radio parts, but at the time, the American tech industry was anchored on the East Coast. And Stanford, in the 1930s and 40s, didn't have a reputation as a strong engineering school. All of that was about to change when America entered World War II.
Yesterday, December 7th, 1941, a date which will live in infamy. The United States of America was suddenly and deliberately attacked by naval and air forces of the Empire of Japan.
Before the war, leaders in Washington had been watching the German war machine march across Europe. It was clear that technology had come a long way since World War I. There were better guns, tanks, radar, airplanes. People close to President Roosevelt recognized that this was going to be a war of technology. But
America didn't have the infrastructure for a technology war. There was no government-funded war machine comparable to what the Germans had. We needed a partnership between the federal government and institutions of science, like universities. Here's Stanford professor Steve Blank.
Before World War II, there was essentially zero federal dollars given to any university in the United States for research.
In the late 1930s?
No National Science Foundation, no National Institute of Health, no federal research agency.
The U.S. government needed a way to bring more scientists into the war effort, and quickly. One person led the effort to recruit America's best scientists and engineers, Vannevar Bush.
Good evening, Dr. Bush.
Why, good evening, Ed.
How are you tonight?
Very well indeed, thank you.
Well, sir, I've known you a number of years, and last week I managed to mispronounce Vannevar, and I apologize.
Well, you've got plenty of company there, Ed. Most everyone mispronounces it. I think the record is held by one Toastmaster who managed to pronounce it in 4 different ways in the course of one evening.
If you want a visual, picture a tall and skinny man. He kind of looked like Bill Nye the Science Guy.
Dr. Vannevar Bush is one of America's more important citizens. Dr. Bush has been called the Dean of American Scientists, one of the great mathematicians, electrical engineers, and research administrators of our time.
Bush had had a successful career as an engineer. He'd co-founded Raytheon Electronics, and in 1932, he became Dean of Engineering at MIT. Over the years, he developed close ties with D.C. and held some positions in government.
The first civilian scientist to sit with our highest war council.
Which is why, after Japan bombed Pearl Harbor, Bush was the go-to guy to get scientists from all over the country to work together at Harvard and MIT. These universities had the best research labs.
They were tasked with solving specific military-oriented problems, very clear and crisp problems. Help me sink subs, help me get these planes through the German air defense system, help me, make our anti-aircraft guns more effective.
During the war, American scientists built some of the first digital computers. While we were working on this episode, we wanted to see what these early machines were like, so we took a trip to the Computer History Museum in Mountain View.
We met a curator named Chris Garcia, and he showed us the ENIAC.
So ENIAC was this massive computer that was designed to be used to calculate firing tables.
What are firing tables?
They're tables that actually allow you to figure out the big guns they were firing in World War II, to figure out how much powder you have to use, the proper aim for all of that.
Basically, a firing table helps you pinpoint your target. It takes into account all kinds of uncertainties, like wind speed and wind direction, speed of your target, missile weight, and so on.
And figuring out a single firing table by hand could take up to a month. And they had to do hundreds of these. There's a story that ENIAC, by the time it was done, after about, 12 years it ran, had done more mathematics, more raw math than all of humankind had done up to that point. And so, that sort of boggles the mind. In 10 years, they'd taken, a couple thousand years of math and just did it all right then.
Engineers were doing more than just building computers.
Key scientific figures in the development of the proximity fuse: Merle II, Vannevar Bush, Alexander Elliott. Under Dr. Bush's direction, 1,000 other scientists and many thousands of workers helped produce one of the war's most effective weapons.
Vannevar Bush was helping coordinate projects focused on communications and radar technologies. He also oversaw the Manhattan Project, which created the atomic bomb that ended the war.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy. That bomb has more power than 20,000 tons of TNT. With this bomb, we have now added a new and revolutionary increase in destruction.
I have received this afternoon a message from the Japanese government
I deem this reply a full acceptance of the Potsdam Declaration, which specifies the unconditional surrender of Japan.
For better or worse, World War II made America a leader in modern technology. And at the end of the war, Vannevar Bush wanted America to continue to be a place of great science.
There were a lot of people who were recruited from academia into the wartime effort, right?
This is Margaret O'Mara, a professor at the University of Washington.
So you have, the Manhattan Project and beyond. You needed a heck of a lot of scientists. So the U.S. The Department of War is hiring on a lot of folks.
Both science and industry work together under the direction of the United States Army, which achieved a unique success in an amazingly short time.
Bush is distinctive in that he's hired on in a leading role, and he's hired on to he's hired on to run a wartime effort. And by the end of the war, he is sketching out a plan for the president. First he presents this to Roosevelt, and then Truman is the one who executes it, for a kind of permanent state of affairs where you have scientists and engineers, but science was the way they were framing it, as a permanent part, advising government, where the federal government is funneling money for basic research, not just applied research, but basic research. And Bush has the idea for what becomes the National Science Foundation.
Universities had already bitten the apple. That is, every research university's lab had expanded by a factor of 10 or greater.
We have spent more than $2 billion on the greatest scientific gamble in history.
With federal funding and facilities and unlimited capital, and what do you mean we're not going to continue this? This is great. We got to continue this.
And here is where the story becomes relevant to Silicon Valley. One of the scientists who went east was a man named Fred Terman. In the 1920s, he had done a PhD at MIT under Vannevar Bush. And during the war, Terman oversaw hundreds of scientists working on radar and anti-aircraft research. But Terman's roots are actually in Palo Alto. He grew up here and had been a professor at Stanford. After the war, he came back, inspired by Vannevar Bush's vision for a partnership between government and university scientists.
Stanford had largely been left out of the wartime effort, and Terman didn't want that to happen again.
And Terman's experience in working, with Bush, seeing this mobilization of science.
What has been done is the greatest achievement of organized science in history.
Watching the Manhattan Project come together, this extraordinary triumph of physics.
It is a harnessing of the basic power of the universe.
In such short order.
The force from which the sun draws his power has been loosed against those who brought war to the far...
Made him understand the power of large-scale scientific investment, and he also clued in, there's going to be a new state of affairs.
When he came back to Stanford, he came back as Dean of Engineering. So in 1946, I think Terman becomes 45, comes back and is Dean of Engineering. And after seeing what he saw on the East Coast, basically says, we're never going to be left out of government funding again.
It's a real opportunity for a place like Stanford. Suddenly, if you have a National Science Foundation, not all the money can go to Harvard and MIT. Suddenly, new players can come in the game.
Terman wants to create powerhouse programs at Stanford and encourage labs to develop technologies that are important for industry. He's got a plan. Step 1, lure top scientists out west.
Basically takes 11 of his senior managers from the radio research lab and somehow gets them appointed to be Stanford faculty.
One of the huge selling points? The great weather. Another selling point, suburbia.
Stanford is in a place that suddenly becomes right at the center of post-war suburbanization, where Palo Alto and its surrounding communities transform from these sleepy little railroad towns that are 35 miles distant from where all the action was in San Francisco to becoming bedroom suburbs and then job centers.
There are no skyscrapers in Silicon Valley. It's wide streets, cul-de-sacs, neighborhood parks. Even though it's really expensive to live here, to this day, it still looks very suburban, like the 1950s American dream.
Everyone was going to the suburbs in droves, and so it was a high-end, attractive suburb. Yes, the price of housing in Palo Alto was slightly higher. It was a more high-end place, but it was by no means expensive, and there was an ease of living here, particularly for people who are transplants from the East Coast who've been dealing with the snows of Rochester and Syracuse in particular. That is very attractive.
Okay, so step 1, lure people. Step 2, Terman encouraged his students to start companies, become entrepreneurs.
What he did is he made the culture as first dean of engineering and then provost okay for faculty to sit on boards of directors, be advisors, and tell their students, yeah, PhD is great and becoming an academic is wonderful and working for General Electric, that's great. But there's another great career where you could serve your country and do the right thing and start something.
For Terman, starting a company is an act of patriotism. In fact, this idea had been in Terman's head long before World War II. Back in the 1930s, he encouraged his grad students, David Packard and William Hewlett, to start their own business. And Hewlett-Packard was born.
Okay, so step 2, spawn companies. The next step might sound kind of mundane at first, but it's important. Step 3 is to develop the Stanford lands. If you listened to our last episode about the history of Stanford, you may remember that one of the university's founding tenets was that Stanford lands could never be sold. As the Bay Area grew in the post-war years, the land became more valuable. University administrators, led by Terman, decided to lease the land.
One of the most important projects was Stanford Industrial Park, a carefully designed series of offices and labs that Stanford grads could move into to start their own companies. Hewlett-Packard headquarters is still there today.
That brings us to step 4. Maintain close ties with the military. World War II was over, but the U.S. had a new enemy, the Soviet Union. The pressure to win the war of technology remained.
He's building up specific research labs that are very much geared to the types of technologies that the Cold War needs, that defense contractors are building, and creates very close relationships with electronics companies and defense contractors who come here.
We thought we had a gun to our head, and the virtual gun was, in World War II, our survival, and in the Cold War, we believe the same thing.
I think today when we hear about doing defense work, this sounds a little dark to us. Absolutely not the case then.
This is historian Leslie Berlin.
We're going into the Cold War. This is the time when a patriotic way to serve your country was to help build weapons.
As tensions between the Americans and the Soviets are growing, defense companies start setting up operations out west. Lockheed decides to locate its Space Missile Division in Sunnyvale, just a few miles south of Palo Alto.
And so Lockheed in 1956 sets up Lockheed Missiles and Space Division and goes from 0 to 20,000 engineers in 4 years.
Wow.
4 years.
That's a huge transformative thing. Terman is early in making sure that there is a really productive partnership between Lockheed and Stanford.
Terman's grand plan works. He lures out smart scientists, encourages them to start companies, helps push Stanford to develop its lands into industrial parks, and he makes sure that the young industry is meeting the needs of their main customer, the American military.
And there's one other thing.
The other thing he did in 1956 was convince a guy who had been in charge of radar bombing training and the deputy director for anti-submarine operations research, was about to win a Nobel Prize, to set up his semiconductor company in Palo Alto. His name was William Shockley.
William Shockley is the inventor of the transistor, which is this little device that miniaturized electronics. It's essentially the basis of all modern-day computing.
The impact of the transistor on the electronic industry and on our society is unquestioned.
And Shockley, people don't know, had spent the year before thinking about taking the job at the Defense Weapons Systems Evaluation Group. So Shockley was an old kind of military player as well. And Terman said this would be a perfect place. And so 1956, two things changed. One is the Cold War came to Silicon Valley, and the other is Silicon came to Silicon Valley, and Terman had his hand in both.
When Steve Blank says that silicon came to Silicon Valley with William Shockley, it's because early transistors were actually made using a different semiconductor, germanium. But Shockley's new company, Shockley Semiconductor, was the first to use silicon instead.
Shockley starts hiring engineers, and one person he has his eyes set on is a scientist named Robert Noyce. Noyce was a math whiz from Iowa who had gotten his PhD in physics from MIT. He's a handsome fellow, looked a little like a young Hugh Hefner. One day, Noyce got a phone call from William Shockley. Here's Leslie Berlin.
Noyce's phone rang. He picked it up, and there's this voice at the other end that says, "Shockley here." And he asked if Noyce would want to come. Noyce absolutely knew he wanted to come. He had wanted to come to California ever since he'd shoveled snow for the first time in Iowa. And he hung up the phone, said to himself, and would say for the rest of his life, that picking up the phone and talking to William Shockley was like picking up the phone and talking to God.
So Noyce comes out to California, where he joins a talented crew working under Shockley. Their goal is to build a state-of-the-art transistor. And the whole team worked really well together. They formed tight bonds as a group. But their relationship to the big boss, to Shockley, not so great.
Shockley was tough to work for. He had an ego and unpredictable mood swings, and his team thought that the research was heading in the wrong direction. So a faction of Shockley's team, they decide to leave and start their own company. Now, this group had to persuade Robert Noyce to join them and leave as well. Noyce felt loyal to Shockley, so he held out for a while. But eventually, he agreed. This group came to be known as the Traitorous Eight. They all handed in their resignation on the same day. Shockley was furious.
This was just not what people did at that time. The notion of spinning a startup out of a company, or you're unhappy, go start your own thing. This was just not something people really did.
The Traitorous Eight got funding from an East Coast investor named Sherman Fairchild. So the new company was called Fairchild Semiconductor.
The rapport among these eight was really wonderful, particularly at the beginning. One of them described to me how they would just stand in a circle, the eight of them, just multiple conversations happening, and just without even looking, kind of lighting each other's cigarettes. And there was a sense of camaraderie there, and a sense that they were doing something really new.
So with Robert Noyce at the helm, the Fairchild team began working on their new project, perfecting the silicon transistor.
Today, the electronics revolution has transformed manufacturing. New kinds of challenges confront communications scientists and engineers.
Transistors were essential components of navigation systems on ballistic missiles, and the US government needed them urgently. The Soviets had just launched Sputnik, and it seemed like America was losing the war of technology.
It took the Fairchild team months to make transistors up to the government's specifications.
To make today's components, they must probe matter more deeply, to deal with temperatures from 200 degrees below to 2,000 degrees above zero Fahrenheit. They must create new materials and shape them on a molecular scale. This requires new tools, new processing techniques, an entirely new manufacturing environment.
But once they succeeded, demand for silicon transistors took off. Soon after, Bob Noyce and Gordon Moore invented the microchip to be used for navigation on satellites.
The American semiconductor industry, which turned Silicon Valley from orchards all the way to now where there's no orchards left, is all because of the semiconductor and because of getting money, government money typically, to do all this research in the 1960s.
Fairchild Semiconductor created the basis of modern-day startup culture. The Traitorous Eight made it okay to leave and start your own thing. Take risks.
You started to have spin-out after spin-out after spin-out after spin-out. Dozens of companies spun out of Fairchild Semiconductor because Fairchild itself just couldn't keep up with the pace of innovation. And these little spin-out companies, spin-outs from Fairchild, gained the collective name the Fairchildren, which I love. Fairchild Semiconductor is like a seed pod that burst, and all of these little seeds kind of traveled across the valley and across the world and pollinated all of these new flowers that came up and really became the seedbed of our modern tech economy.
In some ways, Bob Noyce was the first superstar Silicon Valley entrepreneur. He has at least 3 major accomplishments to his name. 1, he co-invented the microchip. 2, he encouraged others to start their own spin-off companies. In fact, Noyce himself ended up leaving Fairchild with Gordon Moore to start Intel.
The third thing that Noyce did was serve as inspiration or direct mentor to a number of the entrepreneurs who came later, most prominent among them, Steve Jobs.
To this day, companies across Silicon Valley trace their lineage back to Fairchild. National Semiconductor, AMD, Apple, Netscape, Sun Microsystems, and countless others. And the tech industry here never would have taken off without its first loyal customer, the American military. Steve Blank says that, in a way, the military was the first venture capitalist. Federal dollars primed the pump.
The geopolitics of the Cold War steered big money to this region and turned Silicon Valley into a center of power. But it also imbued this region with a deep faith in technology. After all, America was lifted to victory on the shoulders of engineers on the cutting edge of science.
And if there's one person responsible for laying the groundwork, it's Fred Terman.
He had a sense of patriotism that was shared broadly among that mid-20th century generation. And also a real faith in technological progress as bettering things that was very, shared very widely. Something that only becomes questioned really in the Vietnam War era, when the excesses of technology and military technology in particular become quite evident.
Vietnam and the counterculture of the 60s would completely reshape Silicon Valley.
Next time on Raw Data.
Computers were the enemy throughout the 1960s.
Do you know what we have here? We have an army, a Nirvana army. An army all around, but they don't hook to the new tunes.
The Raw Data team is Mike Osborne, Jackson Roach, Isha Salian, and me, Leslie Chang. Our next episode will be coming out in a week. If you're enjoying this series, please subscribe to our show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. We'd also love it if you'd give us a rating.
Leslie Berlin's book, The Man Behind the Microchip, tells the story of Bob Noyce. Margaret O'Mara's book, Cities of Knowledge, traces the history of Silicon Valley through Stanford. We also recommend Annalee Saxenian's Regional Advantage. Also, if you're not familiar with Daniel Swain's Weather West blog, it is the go-to place for California weather. You can find more at weatherwest.com. He's also very active on Twitter, at weather_west.
Steve Blank has a great talk as well as a number of blog posts about the hidden history of Silicon Valley. You can find it all on his website, steveblank.com.
Thank you to Allison Burke of the Stanford Cyber Initiative and to the whole Worldview team for their support, help, and love.
Follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Raw Data Podcast. Our website is rawdatapodcast.com. There you can find all of our past episodes as well as blog posts. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll be back in a week.